live here on Instagram. Hey y'all, so I think I'm live on Instagram and LinkedIn. Let's check LinkedIn. Hey, welcome to another weekly live stream with yours truly, Dr. Sarah Webb. I'm excited that this week's topic is all about the history of colorism. That is always a question people have, is how did we get here? Why are we in the boat that we're in terms of colorism? So feel free to say hello in the chat. I will be saving time at the end for your questions, but you're always welcome to leave comments throughout the conversation. Okay, good. I see that LinkedIn is now joining us. And if you are unfamiliar with Colorism Healing, or if this is your first time tuning in, I'm Dr. Sarah Webb, and I provide speaking, training, consulting to different companies, organizations, and institutions that are seeking to advance their DEI mission. And this live is part of an ongoing series. I think we're in week 4 or 5, an ongoing series based on my new ebook / PDF resource called Corporate Colorism, Why Business Leaders Must Upgrade Their Anti-Racist Strategies. But you can download that as a free PDF if you'd like to read ahead of class each week to see what the insights and what the topics are going to be about. That resource should be linked below, especially if you're on YouTube or at LinkedIn. Hey, Michael. Hey, Fatia. Welcome. I did start a few minutes late, so I apologize if you all were waiting for me to go live. I was in another meeting that ran right at the hour, so it took me a couple of minutes to get set up. So I want to jump in. As I mentioned last week, the part of the series that we're in for corporate colorism is looking at the history of colorism and how we got here. And as I was preparing for this live, I realized that I wanted to do this in 3 parts. So the most popular era for discussing the history of colorism is the Colonial Era. And I want to start there because it is probably one that most people are familiar with in terms of thinking about why colorism is an issue today. But I also thought about how it's really hard in the 30 minutes that I've allotted for these live streams to talk about the totality of the history, especially if we talk about the history cross-culturally and thinking about some of the regional nuances of how colorism has evolved, how it started and how it's evolved over time in different cultures around the globe. So I'm going to start this week with looking at the colonial history again, because it's the common pattern that we refer to. But I want to go back next week to the pre-colonial era. So looking at skin tone stratification, hierarchies based on skin color before certain places, countries, nations, and peoples were victimized by colonization. And then also looking at the post-colonial era. So I'll do that as a third part, thinking about, so after slavery, after the Emancipation Proclamation, after colonization stopped in the quote unquote formal sense. We know it never really stopped. There is no post-colonial era. But thinking about some of the history in more recent times, even some of the history that we ourselves might have lived through, or that our parents and grandparents have lived through. So this week we're going to start by thinking about the history of colorism. And I titled the thumbnail for this, "Is Racism Really the Result of Colorism?" And so we recognize that in modern day forms of colorism in particular, that a lot of it is rooted in that interracial colorism. So if you missed the previous live streams, it might behoove you to go back to catch up and get some of the foundational knowledge that a lot of my ongoing series is based on. We talked about that there are 2 types of colorism, and one of them is interracial colorism. And just reminding folks that yes, white people can be colorist. White people do see, recognize, and then assign value to differences, physical differences amongst people that they perceive as non-white, okay? And so the colonial history reinforced some skin tone hierarchies in a lot of places around the world. But then in other places, that is the birth or the result of those skin tone hierarchies. But there's another truth that I talk about often. And if you've ever seen me present or, do a keynote, do a webinar, you've probably heard me say this before. But we've all likely heard of the phrase or the statement that race is a social construct. Have you heard of that before? Is that something that people have told you before? Race is a social construct. And usually they're saying that to dismiss conversations of racism. Very, very rarely are people saying that in a useful way. But I think it's very, very useful here in talking about colorism and why we can't talk about racism divorced from colorism, because race is a social construct, but skin tone is a biological fact with socially constructed meanings. Okay, so I'm going to repeat that. Race might be a social construct, but skin tone is a biological fact with socially constructed meanings. And here's the kicker. One of the socially constructed meanings of skin tone is race itself. Okay? And so we cannot talk about race. We can't talk about racism as if it exists independently or outside of the influence and the interpretation and the value systems that are placed on physical features, such as skin tone, such as hair texture, such as facial features, right? And so a lot of people who again, are dismissive or try to trivialize colorism as an issue are failing to realize or are choosing not to realize the role that skin tone and hair texture and facial features played in the construction of race itself. And so I want to read this quote that I always read by Thomas Jefferson. And this is from his Notes on the State of Virginia. And this is an example. This quote is an example of the zeitgeist, of the pseudoscience, of the anthropology, of what was considered truth or considered normal during that time period, as during the colonial period, as they were constructing whiteness in particular and constructing racial categories in general. So Thomas Jefferson wrote, quote, "The first difference which strikes us is that of color." I'm going to repeat it because y'all not hearing me. The first difference which strikes us is that of color. So again, y'all need to stop saying y'all don't see color, especially if you're white. White people have seen color since the dawn of time, okay? And is this difference of no importance? Is it not the foundation of a greater or less share of beauty in the two races, right? So here Thomas Jefferson, again, reflecting the common beliefs, the widely accepted ideology of his time, reflecting that, one, we see differences in color. We absolutely do see that people from this continent have different physical features than people from another continent. They absolutely saw that. But two, the important thing here, when he says, is not the foundation of a greater or less share of beauty in the two races. So the second thing we see is that we don't just see differences in people based on their physical features. We also are assigning value to people based on those physical differences. We are saying because of these physical differences, these types of people are more beautiful than these types of people. That has been the case from the beginning, right? The colonial era, again, was predicated on establishing firm boundaries about who's different from us as colonizers, right? Who is different from us and how can we prove that difference? And the physical features, skin tone and hair texture especially, were considered tangible physical proof that we were inherently different, and not just a benign or neutral difference, but that difference also indicated relative superiority or inferiority. Okay, so I'm trying to be very clear about that. So then he goes on to say, add to these flowing hair a more elegant symmetry of form. Besides those of color, figure, and hair, there are other physical distinctions proving a difference of race, okay? So this was, again, published by Thomas Jefferson, and it was, again, a reflection of the widely accepted, the widely believed anthropology or pseudoscientific knowledge and information and education that was being spread and propagated around the world. And so this quote, I think, in terms of thinking about why colorism exists and how we got here and how colonization, global colonization, has contributed to these beliefs about more Eurocentric features, lighter skin, straighter hair, thinner noses, being seen or viewed as superior to other features that are kinkier afro hair, textured hair, darker skin tones, is the project, the purpose of this is to establish or to justify or to try and define Europeans as superior, the colonizers. I mentioned this last week or a few weeks before, is that they needed the world to believe that they were superior, right? And so they're looking for evidence. They are searching for evidence, so-called evidence, to try and prove that they deserve to rule, that they deserve to dominate, that they deserve to steal and hoard and pillage, right? And so thinking about, again, the physical features being used to determine, define, or to justify categories of people, and then two, choosing that or using that to then assign value to those things. So this is part of why we have a scenario like colorism. But then the second thing is that the entire project for constructing race was a tool for asserting dominance. And the people who had the power to create these anthropological studies, the people who had the power and the authority to write and publish these tomes, like what Thomas Jefferson wrote, whether they be, monarchies in Europe or whether they be people who came to the colonies and took ownership, took the land and the status in order to do these things. Again, it was for the purpose of asserting their own hegemonic dominance over local people. And again, when the view of physical differences is used in terms of colorism, it is affirming for white people their superiority. And so this is why even white people see those with lighter skin tones as better, because it reaffirms their sense that they are better, right? If their ideology, if their power, if their ability to control and manipulate and dominate rests in the belief that they are supposedly superior, then they have to reinforce a system that says the more like us you are, the better you are. Okay, I hope that's clear. Let me know if that's clear. I see some comments coming in. They have to support that system. They have to establish that system. They have to teach that system and condition people to believe that because white is supposedly superior, then they have to reinforce this hierarchy that says the closer you are to being white or the more European ancestry you have in your DNA, then that means you are better because you're more like us, right? And the farther away, the more different, quote unquote, you are from us, then the more inferior you are. And I talked again in previous live streams about the role that anti-Blackness plays in all of this specifically, and how in order to construct whiteness as a concept, they needed a direct foil. They needed a supposed opposite to whiteness. And so Black people, the idea of Black people, people with darker skin tones, people with hair textures that were seen as more different than theirs, people with facial features that were seen as the most different from theirs, right? And so that's where that binary or that polarity came from. But again, they are able to reinforce the notion of their superiority by giving greater status, giving greater value, giving greater access to people who are closer along the spectrum of human skin tones and human phenotypes to what they are, okay? So that's a very general, broad overview in terms of why colonialism and how colonialism has contributed to this phenomenon that we now know as colorism. And so, yes, if you're just joining, I talked about how there have been skin tone hierarchies even before colonization happened in various parts of the world. So next week, I'll kind of go back and touch on how those operated. But what we can understand here is that even the skin tone hierarchies that existed before colonialism were reinforced and re-entrenched in ways that they would have never been prior to colonialism. I see some questions coming in. The last thing I'll say too, because I'm also going to talk in 2 weeks about the post-colonial era. And that is going to be about how we as Black people, other people of color, other indigenous people started to internalize that, right? So again, it was the project of colonizers in order to construct their own sense of whiteness, in order to justify the violence that they were enacting around the world. They had to establish themselves as deserving of rule, of deserving to dominate. And so the project of defining whiteness and constructing whiteness was a part of that project. It wasn't just, oh, we just want to be white. This is not just some random thing. This is not some random hierarchy that we're asserting. We're asserting this hierarchy so that we can have more money. We're asserting this hierarchy so that we have more land. We're asserting this hierarchy so that we have more power to control the flow of resources and the flow of the economy, right? And so that was the purpose of the social construction of race. And so if you're just tuning in, I talked about Thomas Jefferson's quote and how in their constructing of race, they relied heavily on the physical differences that they perceived in the races. Now, there are other things, right? There are other language differences, religious differences, other cultural differences that were tied up into the construction of race. But since we're talking about colorism, I'm emphasizing the fact that skin tone and hair texture were core elements as well. And if you look at that quote, he literally says, the first difference we see between the races is that of color. Okay, so we have to not go on ignoring that fact, that reality, that what we now consider as racism, and many people say, oh, racism is the worst problem, or racism is the parent, and colorism is sort of like the offspring, the offshoot of that. The quote by Thomas Jefferson sort of flips that on its head and says, before race ever existed, and this is what I want to say on this live stream here, before ideas and concepts of race, before the concept, the structures of race and racism ever existed, people have always had different skin tones and have been treated differently based on that, right? Especially within the context of European colonization. People have always had different hair textures. We've always noticed differences. Again, in this case, we're focusing on the physical differences, but people have always noticed differences in language. They've always noticed that, because the idea of race as we currently use it definitely did not always exist or operate, was not always a factor in the way that it is today. But what was always noticed, what was always considered, what was always an obvious point of difference were physical features like skin tone, hair texture. Again, alongside things like language, religion, and other cultural practices. And so when we think about how we talk about colorism as being like, oh, we just need to solve racism and then we'll solve colorism. Or, colorism is just the second cousin of racism, right? All the ways that we diminish what colorism actually is in the world and what colorism actually is in society kind of falls flat or is dismantled when we understand that there would have not really been racial differences without first the valuing and the establishing a hierarchy of people based on the physical features like skin tone. I know that's not a common argument to make. Let me see what the comments are saying. Hey folks, I'm going to start off with my Instagram comments. Just a few have come in so far on Instagram. How y'all doing? Dropped Jim. Thank you for the badge. Says, yes, that is original of colorism. Thanks for sharing it. This societal standard imposed on Black people, braced with the advantages, benefits, and great opportunities given to white skin issues. Yeah. So let me see. I saw a lot of conversation happening on LinkedIn. I'm really curious. And a little bit on YouTube. Let me see what you all are discussing here. If you're just tuning in, this is part of an ongoing series based on my new ebook / PDF resource called Corporate Colorism: Why Business Leaders Must Upgrade Their Anti-Racist Strategies. You can download the PDF for free on my website, or you can purchase the ebook on Amazon. And this is going to be an ongoing series of live streams. And right now we're in a section looking at the history of colorism and why we are here. Hey, y'all. Let me see if I can identify the questions versus comments on YouTube. Aya says, yes, This is the thing that I am finding that people just don't want to be honest about nowadays. People really think whiteness is better. So therefore they deserve the most. And the sad thing is that we are so conditioned and intimidated and manipulated and dominated that some of us believe this too. Absolutely. So when I talk about the post-colonial history, I'm going to talk about what happened once we started to internalize that belief, once we started to also believe it. The more like us you are, the better you are. Boom. Teach, sis. I be trying to teach. I try to teach. I try. And to think they were continually raping Black women, we need to talk about this more. The cognitive dissonance, disgusting. Oh, yeah, I was saying I don't believe we are in a post-colonial era. I mean, we are technically, but now it's more covert. It's like covert narcissism versus regular old narcissism. Yeah, absolutely. There was never, colonialism never stopped. It hasn't stopped. I think post-colonial is just a way to talk about a distinction in the, like you're saying, overt forms of colonization where nations supposedly got their freedom. You know, this nation became independent in this year and this nation gained their independence in that year, right? But it kind of clouds or occludes the fact that those nations are very much still being puppeted by the original nations that colonized them. Hi, Kentilla says, hi, Sarah. Thanks for all you do. I love to hear from you. Your experience has given us a lot of wisdom. Thank you. Michael with the hashtags. Yeah, so this is, a little taste of the colonial history of colorism and thinking about how we are participating in white supremacy if we condone colorism, because that is ultimately the birth of this struggle. And I'm not saying that, a lot of times I try to decenter whiteness in these things, but really it's hard to get around it, right? Not that whiteness or European colonization or that white people have to always be the center of our conversations. But given this particular moment in history, we have to understand the source of the problem, right? And white people have been a huge source of the problem. Now, again, later on, I'm going to talk about how although they might be the original source of the problem, we as Black people, we as other indigenous people have taken up the mantle to perpetuate the problem, right? Which is how we can gain control, how we can use our agency to stop contributing, stop being complicit in the problems, right? So even though we're not responsible for the problem, for creating the problem, we are responsible for our role in solving it and our role in not continuing to perpetuate it. So your homework and affirmations, if there are no more questions or no more comments. You're welcome, Marine Mom Creole. Let's see. Okay, cool. So I think I've gotten through all your comments and questions. I'm going to leave you with your homework and your affirmations for today. Your homework. Oh, also, I meant to include this in my introduction. So one of the reasons why it's important to talk about the past, and I always critique historical discussions of colorism. Part of the problem in solving colorism is that people want to have conversations about colorism that do not account for history. I think I posted about this on Instagram about how a lot of light-skinned people who complain about so-called reverse colorism are not taking into account the history of colorism, right? And so anytime we try to talk about an issue without understanding the history of that issue, then we are powerless to actually solve it, right? Understanding how you got into a problem is key to understanding how you're going to get out of that problem. So our homework is to recall a time when learning something about history helped you better understand the present. Okay, what was the lesson for you? Think about a time when learning something about history helped you better understand the present situation at hand. And then what was that lesson? And so for us, in terms of colorism, really to drive home the point, when we understand that the physical differences between people, especially skin tone and hair, gave rise to or justified or validated supposedly racial categories and justified or validated hierarchies, social hierarchies based on those physical differences, then we are empowered in the present to realize, one, that there is a larger system that seeks to divide us, right? Two, that there's a larger system that is not just making these distinctions because, there are different people, but trying to assign value to those people in order to hoard wealth and resources for a select few. And then your affirmation is, I seek to understand the past so I can be empowered in the present. I seek to understand the past so that I can be empowered in the present. And again, especially for us as Black people in the diaspora, especially for us as other indigenous people around the globe, the history of colonization, whether we want to center it or focus on it or not, has impacted us in ways that are unimaginable, ways that are violent, ways that are painful, ways that have not ended. And that's the other thing too. We talk about the history of violence against Black people, the history of violence against genocide, rape, pillaging of people around the globe. It's not even like that's just in the past. That violence, psychological, physical, emotional violence, never stopped. It never ceased. But I think we get trapped. One of the reasons we internalize that violence, one of the reasons we internalize these ideologies is because we think that they're natural. We think that, that's the way the world is, so that must be the way the world is supposed to be. But when we understand history, when we're able to see when and how and where these systems and these ideologies were constructed, then we realize that they actually aren't natural. And when we realize that, this was constructed by people, then that means it doesn't have to be this way, right? It's not like, I have to have a heartbeat in order to survive, right? Colorism is not as natural to us as our heart beating or the blood flowing through our veins. And once we understand that, we're actually able to not internalize it. We're actually able to say, no, this notion of my inferiority is actually not innate or inherent. It's a construct that was created for these specific purposes to benefit this select few group of people, right? And so I also think that having that understanding of history empowers us in the present, but it's also a key to not internalizing our present circumstance, right? Because if I was born into slavery and I thought that the world had always been like that, or if I was born into slavery or born into Jim Crow segregation or born into apartheid South Africa, and I didn't realize the history and why that system was created and by whom it was created and for what aims and purposes, then I am likely to internalize it. I am likely to believe or agree, I was born this way, so maybe that's just the way I am. Maybe that's the truth, right? And so we have to teach our children their history. We have to teach all people history. We have to learn the history for ourselves and realize that, we find ourselves in these very troubling, problematic, oppressive regimes and systems, but they're not organic to the earth. They're not organic to our people. They happened at some point in history. They evolved, they developed, they were constructed throughout history. And therefore, I know that it's not the truth of who I am, right? But this is a false ideology that was created in order to suppress me. And so once I understand that it's a false thing, once I understand it's a constructed thing, I don't have to accept it. I don't have to internalize it. I hope that makes sense. I'm way past time. I'm 5 minutes over, but I did start 5 minutes late. So I think it comes out to be a wash. All right. So that was your homework and your affirmations. Thank you all so much for being here. I do want to read these last little comments. So I'm just going to read these last little comments and then we'll say goodbye for now. Deep House Nation says, I think ensuring religious imagery is historically accurate will help address colorism. That Jesus statue in Brazil is indoctrination 101. So Deep House Nation, your point about religious imagery being historically accurate, I think speaks to the idea that we have to actually know history because, and also the fact that thinking about the trying not to teach certain history within the United States and other places in the world. We don't want to teach that history. This all speaks to the point that I'm trying to make, which is once we know history, not just based on, the hunter, but the lion also being able to tell history. Once we know that, it changes the game. And so people who are trying to retain their power and their hegemonic domination, people who want to retain that, they need us to not actually know the history behind it. They need us to not actually look beyond just the present moment and say, where did these things come from? Because that empowers us to then be able to resist. Let's see. What is your IG? Are you talking to me? Aya? What is your IG handle? Says this info was heavy and needs to be heard by everybody. Yeah. Hey, Jupiter F. Stone. Thanks for joining. It doesn't have to be this way. First thing I heard. Yeah, I think that's a good first thing to hear. It doesn't have to be this way. And I was saying that when you learn history and you understand history, you realize that it didn't have to be that way, right? That choices were made for particular reasons in order to make it this way. What do you think about the history of dark-skinned people being hidden, like the Negritos and the Andaman Islands? Up until recently, I thought only colonists brought dark-skinned people around the world. I'm not sure what you meant about that last point, but the history of dark-skinned people being hidden, and I'm assuming you're meaning not acknowledged within the mainstream, right? Because I know even within Mexico, not acknowledging the fact that Black people and dark-skinned people have existed in these places for centuries. Again, I think that's in order to create and reinforce the narrative of so-called Black inferiority and so-called European or white supremacy. And so if we can say that, our nation or our people or our culture is only white or only light-skinned or only XYZ, then you reinforce the notion that that is inherently superior. And even thinking about trying to erase us, your point, MW, is also speaking to forms of erasure that have happened and not acknowledging the contribution that dark-skinned people have had to culture, not acknowledging the contributions that dark-skinned people have had to society, to creating knowledge, to the construction of all that we have today, right? And so again, hiding that reality, hiding that fact, and making it seem as if the only people who have contributed to society have been Europeans or have been non-Black people, right? I think it's part of the project. It's part of the anti-Black mission that they have in order to hoard wealth and power and hegemonic domination for themselves. Also, fear of reprisal, as demonstrated throughout our history. So when we think about being empowered in the present, knowing our history and being empowered in the present, they know. This is why they told us we couldn't read. This is why they tried to keep us from reading. It's because they know as soon as we know, then they're in trouble. And so it behooves them to try to restrict knowledge. It behooves them to try to hide history. It behooves them to try to occlude or cover over the truth of what they've done and the truth of who they are. Because once we know that, then it does empower us. And that, makes them very, very much more vulnerable. All right. I'm going to let you go. I think we are at 40 minutes after the hour, so that's plenty of time. I'll be back next week going pre-colonial. So thinking about before the world global mission from many European countries as a result, again, capitalist empire making before that, right? Thinking about different places in the globe and the skin tone hierarchies that existed there as well. And this is helping us think about colorism cross-culturally. So I will leave you with that. Don't forget your homework. I'm really curious to know if you have Any moments in your life where you learned something about history that changed your perspective on the present moment and helped you to learn a lesson that was useful for you in going forward. Much love, y'all. I will see y'all next time.